So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Mihaela van der Schaar, and I'm the director of the Cambridge Center for AI in Medicine. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our seminar series. This is the first talk in our distinguished seminar series. And before I introduce our distinguished speaker today, since our center has just recently been founded, I'm going to use 3 minutes of your time to briefly tell you more about the Cambridge Center for AI in Medicine. So our goal is to develop pioneering artificial intelligence and machine learning methods to transform biomedical science, medicine, and healthcare. And the unique sweet spot of our center is its focus on interdisciplinary cutting-edge research. And what's interesting here is that we believe that medicine and biology are going to drive innovation in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And conversely, we believe that machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies will drive a revolution in medicine and biology. And what we also hope to achieve is a real impact through our collaboration with the two founding partners of our center, AstraZeneca and GSK. The focus of the center is on using machine learning to enable biomedical discovery, enable omics analytics, deliver precision medicine using machine learning, and enabling next generation clinical trials using machine learning. Our center has been relatively recently founded, as a matter of fact, only in November of 2020. And we have had less than 2 weeks ago, our inaugural event. If you are interested to learn more about the Cambridge Center for AI in Medicine, please take a look at our website and you can see more about our research, our activities, and you can see the inaugural event. But without further ado, I would like to start introducing our distinguished speaker today. And again, this is the first speaker of our seminar series. We plan to have around 1 seminar a month with distinguished speakers from all over the world who are active leaders in the area of data science, genomics, medicine. And it is my true pleasure to welcome this seminar series with a big bang by introducing Professor Carlos Bustamante, who is a true leader in the application of data science and artificial intelligence and genomics technology to problems in medicine and biology. Carlos is a professor in the biomedical data science and genetics at Stanford University. But Carlos is not only a professor there, he has been the inaugural chair of the biomedical data science department in Stanford. And Carlos is a unique researcher, but also a unique visionary leader because he started numerous organizations that cross boundaries. And this is what CCAIM center that we have founded aspires to. So it is really a pleasure to have Carlos giving this first talk, which has been an inspiration for me when thinking about founding this center. He also is an illustrious researcher. He has the MacArthur Fellow, was been a MacArthur Fellow in 2010 and has numerous awards, and his publications are extremely highly cited, and he is a true inspiration for us all. So thank you, Carlos, so much for joining us today. And before I'm going to play the recorded video that Carlos has prepared for us, I want to tell you that Carlos is with us in the audience, and he will answer questions at the end of his talk. So please, during the duration of the talk, post your questions in the chat box, and we are going to take as many questions as we possibly can in the 15-20 minutes we have at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here visiting you at Cambridge University. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing on precision health and genomics and how it relates to the broader topic of the innovation economy. So I'm really motivated today by the book of a Cambridge scholar named Bill Janeway, who I think has written just an incredibly important piece of scholarship on how the state, financial investment, and the market economy really drive innovation. And I want to begin by, first, as a matter of almost motivation and also conflict of interest, to say that I've really spent most of my career working as an academic, but collaborating and consulting and working with industry, ultimately starting companies and actually investing in companies myself. And I found it just an extraordinarily rewarding part of the work that I've done. And one of the things I always became interested in is what makes for these successful companies. Why are some able to take on some challenges and not others? And going forward, what would the role of private enterprise be, particularly in the US healthcare system where I operate, in driving innovation? And so the framing here is really this beautiful book by Bill, and I encourage you all to read it. Bill was just a pioneer in financing important speculative ventures, including those in biotechnology, and his book just is a treasure trove of scholarship and learning as an active participant and as a scholar of economics. And so he really sort of sets up for us this idea that we need a virtuous cycle of financial incentivization by the state that takes up mostly basic science and into translation. And then as you've proven out that there's a market for this, financial speculation begins to take bets, and then ideally the best winner wins. And so that idea has really been at the core of the improvement of the human condition over the last 200 years. And I really, again, I encourage you to read Bill's book. And in my thinking, why I think it is so relevant, particularly in the context of US healthcare, is that I think we really need a massive lift to improve the conditions in my country. And it requires both private and public investment. And that's really one of the motivating questions. And a lot of this will require, obviously, the building of just massive digital infrastructure for the analysis of healthcare data. And that's really at the core of what I want to talk about. So the problem I've spent, the last 10 years at Stanford, and I would say the last 20 years as a scholar thinking about are, how do we really deliver precision health at scale for all? How do we use the power of statistics and compute married to bio to improve the human condition? And in my case, I became first interested in this problem at Cornell in working in agriculture and then in human genetics, and then really focused on this problem at Stanford, particularly in the problem of diversifying the base in which we make a lot of this research and ultimately is the core of where this goes. So I had the privilege of being the chair of a department of biomedical data science at Stanford. And the reason I had that opportunity was because our dean set out for us a vision of creating an institution focused on precision health. And at the medical school, the logic here was that we have a wellspring that comes from fundamental biological research that leads to transformative platforms that can really improve our care at Stanford and then ultimately have just, really cascading positive effects. And as we thought about that problem, one of the big issues that, I kept being nagged by is a disproportionate level of chronic disease is found in minority populations. However, the vast majority of genetic studies have been done in populations of European descent, and what problem that may pose for us as we try to diversify the base of studies. So I wrote a piece in 2011 with my colleagues Francisco de la Vega and Esteban Schaar that called attention to this issue. In particular, it was particularly egregious back then. And it's largely that there had been really wonderful investment by Decode and by the UK. And so you guys were far ahead, and most of what we learned about complex disease genetics in the 2000s came from those really, really important first investments. Unfortunately, they weren't representative of the globe. And so some of us said, we've got to improve this, we've got to build better resources. I would argue it has not moved nearly fast enough. So Pope Joy and others in 2016 sort of retook this issue up. There had been improvement largely due to the very logical and necessary investment of China and other countries in genomics. However, when it came to particularly Black and Hispanic populations in the United States, massively underrepresented in this kind of research. So, and why is this a problem? Well, look, first, the country has a shifting demographic. The country will be far more diverse as the population shifts. And then secondly, the translation of biological research takes time. And that's part of the argument that Bill Janeway makes, right? If you want to accelerate that, you actually can't just rely on government to do it. It won't do it alone. You actually need the three-player game to get this going. So how do we bring the three-player game into our field? And I would say my vision is massively open, direct-to-consumer health data being made available for faster, better, cheaper analysis. And that's been at the core of what I've been trying to do for the last 5 years, with a goal of fundamentally disrupting the healthcare system and making this really a far more parallelized system where we can allow many others to gain access. And much of what I'll talk about is actually not even my own research, rather it's my perceptions about where I think the field is going. And this is the one thing I've put together that I'm very proud of. I put this a couple of years ago, and it's just simply my own schematic about what I view as the world of biomedical data science and why it's relevant. And I would say that when the dean asked me to start the department, we were really in this corner. You know, the Stanford runs a big hospital system. It's a massive part of what we do as a university. In fact, I would argue it's probably the biggest revenue generator for the whole university. We're a hospital with a school attached. And so in this hospital with a school attached, we really care a lot about bringing together electronic health records, genomics, imaging, pathology, outcomes to improve our own patient care and learn from that. However, we're of course very focused on our view, as we would in any operation. And of course, a lot of what we think about as scholars is the interaction between the healthcare system and the care providers and the drug and insurance world. How much we pay? Are we doing a good job? I mean, that is the basis of the whole world of healthcare economics. And you and Britain have led the way. You've taught us how to do this better than any place in the world. However, in the United States, we have a far different healthcare system than the one you have in your country. And one of the things that in particular, I think, gets really missed is that the US healthcare system is not optimized to deliver healthcare. I'm going to repeat that. The US healthcare system is not optimized to deliver healthcare. It is optimized to deliver sick care, and it is optimized to deliver acute sick care. And that's very different. Those really are fundamentally different motivating and objective functions. And so if you really want to promote health, you literally cannot do it from the basis of the sick health system. And I'm not being disrespectful. It is literally incentivized for acute care. It is where all the fundamental economics go. And it is where the software that is built goes. So all of the US electronic health record system is around billing. I can tell you exactly how much I pay for every patient down to like $40 or $50. That's actually a question you don't even want to ask in the British healthcare system. You know how much you pay in postage stamps for the entire system, but you don't know how much one person's stay at a hospital is. The whole system is incentivized in a completely different way. So if we actually want to incentivize healthcare in our country, we need the consumer and patient data. It is the only way you're actually going to intervene, and you actually need to intervene at the point of motivating patients and consumers. There's a whole world of legal and regulatory here that of course is important, but in many ways it just bends and warps the space. Data is data, and data will be made available. We have to secure it. We have to have protocols. That's obvious. We do it in finance all the time. Okay, the whole financial system relies on our ability to secure data. We can, of course, secure healthcare data. We can, of course, secure all kinds of data. The question is, how do we make that available and with what purpose? And I would argue that the future really is in partnerships like we saw several years ago between GlaxoSmithKline and 23andMe, looking to really build a powerful network by which they're able to power the next generation of these studies. And again, this is from several years ago. These are the reasons that they partnered in a $300 million partnership. Really it's about accelerating drug discovery in ways that we can make this work. Of course, last week it was announced that 23andMe is now going to go public, led by one of my very, 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 very favorite people, I would say, Richard Branson. I will say I'm a fanboy of Richard Branson. I love the Virgin brand. I've always loved Virgin Atlantic was my favorite airline in the United States. I'm not ashamed to say that. And so I actually think it's quite exciting that the two of them are partnering on this. And part of the logic is they're going to build a subscription health system, and that subscription health system will have just real virtuous cycles working. And I really wish them tremendous luck. I have a huge amount of respect for Anne and for others in this space. And I'll tell you, here's really the fundamental economics in the problem. It costs billions and billions of dollars to bring a drug to market. And we've seen just in the COVID pandemic how difficult it can be, even with tremendous focus, even with shared goals, even with pulling public and private resources together, how hard it is to get to a common set of reagents that solve a common biological problem. Yeah, that's not an easy problem to solve. And we as a community, as a global community, have been trying to do that. And I would say in pretty earnest ways. Everyone's been trying to share data, everyone's trying to get it right. And it's been hard. It has not been easy, right? It has not been easy in any way, shape, or form. Now imagine what's going on behind the scenes with diabetes research, with cardiovascular research. It's not easy. It's not easy work. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of dedication. And I would argue there's a massive amount of data loss and exhaust. If we could figure out how we can encapsulate data, do a far better job of tracking this, we can accelerate this process. And that's part of the logic of what 23andMe is doing. Here's one of the best examples when something like this has worked, when bringing genetics to bear on drug development. And this is just spectacular success in bench to bread side in the discovery of a set of drugs called PCSK9 inhibitors. These are the set of drugs you take if you suffer particularly from a disease called familial hypercholesterolemia. And it was found partly by studying families with that condition. So I want to tell you a little bit about that story, the successes, and actually some of the muted issues that have to do with distribution of this into the market. So the beginnings is just really wonderful genetics. Like in any other trait, your bad cholesterol has a distribution. There are people with high cholesterol and there are people with bad cholesterol. And it turns out some people with high cholesterol have high cholesterol for genetic reasons. And one of those genetic reasons is a very particular breaking of the cholesterol pathway leading to what is known as familial hypercholesterolemia. This is a very extreme form of hereditary high cholesterol. It is caused by primarily 3 different kinds of genes or mutations in these 3 different genes, but more importantly, it's actually not that rare. About 1 in 200 people suffer from familial hypercholesterolemia, and what's particularly worrying is the vast majority of them don't. And some of these people have a lifelong risk of cardiovascular disease that is just exorbitant. And so you really want to get them on medication very early on, because it's not just about controlling diet to lower your bad cholesterol. So just to put this into perspective, here is the 1-to-1 line. So here's everybody who doesn't have familial hypercholesterolemia and their sort of average cholesterol profile. If you happen to carry one mutation in this gene, so you inherited one allele from, say, mom or dad, then by the time you're my age, you would have the lipid profile of somebody in their 60s. And if you were, really, unfortunately to have gotten two alleles, you were homozygous FH, then actually by the time you're a teenager, you have the lipid profile of somebody in their 60s. And so you really, really want to get ahead of this. And this is a condition that is a real poster child for preventative health. If we can get people on medication early, we can literally save their lives. So the wonderful thing about this is that it's also been a treasure trove for linking genetics to drug development and biomarkers. So now 15 years ago, the brilliant team of Helen Hobbs and Jonathan Cohen and colleagues demonstrated that in one of these genes where you have high cholesterol, if you have overexpression of the gene PCSK9, there were people that through just random chance were born with a broken version of the gene. Okay, so high PCSK9 leads to high cholesterol. Broken PCSK9, what happens? Well, it turns out broken PCSK9 turns out to be winning the genetic lottery. You shift. You literally have, by genetics, far less cholesterol. Your set point for cholesterol is just reduced, and that's just a wonderful gift from God. All right, great. Now, does this actually translate clinically? Absolutely. Not only are you protected with lower cholesterol, but in fact, that lower cholesterol translates into reduced incidence of coronary heart disease. And this was just massively, massively interesting. They found this in a multi-ethnic study, including African Americans and European American patients. And so this was just, heralded as great success. And now we can turn the crank and we can do more of this. So great. What's the problem? Well, when this drug first went to market, they were trying to charge $12,000 a year for it. A third of Americans have high cholesterol. You're not going to put a third of Americans on a drug that costs $12,000 a year. You can't. The system won't afford it. So, and this is a problem that, of course, you deal with all the time in the UK. It's a question of how do you reallocate resources, and you have a certain amount of purchasing, and you think very hard about how you allocate those resources. That's very different than in the United States, which is let's put drugs out on the market and figure out, once they've met, clinical improvement criteria, how we finance them. I mean, that really is the kind of difference. And in this case, I think they basically got the business model wrong. They didn't target what should have been targeted, which is, really these patients that have cholesterol from an early age with a biomarker, because most of these patients are not known. And so it is not surprising that when you go out and you try to get these patients on the drug, the insurance says, hey, I'm sorry, I don't have the evidence. And this is part of the problem. So here is, recommendations from the FH Foundation, a group that's set up to help find cures and improve the quality of lives of patients with FH. And they would recommend that everybody basically get screened very early for FH, particularly, if both mom and dad have FH, we should definitely be screening the child for FH and potentially starting them on statin as early as 8 or 9 years old. You have to be very aggressive in some of these cases. And if you don't, know about the parents, maybe you screen when they're going into school or when they're, exiting, school or going into the military or college or something. And so, we should be screening much earlier. That's the point. The average age at which somebody's diagnosed with FH is close to 50, and they've already been on lipid-lowering therapy for several years. So they've already gotten, disease. Some of them have already had an early heart attack or stroke, and this could have literally been avoided. So, and again, this is really just the statistics. The vast majority of patients prescribed a PCSK9 are denied. Okay, there's 95% are denied the first time, 62% are eventually. And this is true whether they're a presumptive FH patient or a high-risk cardiovascular disease patient. That is not true of additional therapies that would be added on top of statins, simply because they're pretty cheap, and so it's easy to make that decision. And so, why does this happen? Well, why this happens because the United States has just transformed from spending about 5% of GDP to close to 20+% of GDP on healthcare, and this is actually underreported. This is actually 2010. The interesting question is the leptocurticy of this, and this has not actually changed. So healthcare systems extraordinarily leptocurtic. The top 1% of claimants eat 22% of the pie. The top 5% of claimants eat 5% of the pie. So we're paying $10,000 per man, woman, child in the country, yet half of Americans use less than $1,000 in healthcare. And this is where you'd have to get that money for preventative cardiovascular disease care in FH patients, and it just doesn't exist. So you wait until they get sick, and there's plenty of money to take care of them in the acute care system. And that's just really what many, many, many people have been trying to figure out how to fight against. And I would argue what's different about my solution. And it's simply to say that I view this as a supply chain optimization problem. And it's really simply about bringing data to bear on the problem. There's just extraordinary waste of information because the systems are simply designed to build. And so if you want to have different results, you have to build different systems. And I would argue, as much as I've been and continue to be and will always be an advocate for machine learning and methods and build departments on this. These become, as we know, tactical weapons. These are not strategy. These are how we solve a problem. These don't tell us what problem to go solve. Okay, and so for all of you who are interested in ethics and AI and how you really reframe this, we can get these systems to be magic. We've seen magic. Now the magic you produce really depends on the spells you want and can't. And what are the spells you want and can't? And that's the fundamental question. What direction do you want to take this? And so I want to just highlight two groups that I think are doing brilliant work. It's not my research, but I think it's just brilliant work. The first is the work out of Vanderbilt. And I've for years been on the record saying that two of my very favorite people in the whole world are Josh Denny and Lisa Bastaracci, because I think they've done just pioneering work in this space. And they have an algorithm called VRS, which basically does magic. It goes through the EHR and it finds patients with presumptive Mendelian diseases. And I really recommend you read their paper. Here's really the logic. You can stream code and think about, is this patient likely to be a patient with cystic fibrosis or a patient not with cystic fibrosis? And because they had genotyped everybody in a representative system of the Vanderbilt healthcare system, they can basically ask, what kind of resources does a cystic fibrosis patient utilize versus control? Sure enough, after a while, you've seen enough code to demonstrate, looks like a CF patient. You can go back and validate. Well, it turns out they demonstrated massive, I would say, under reporting of true disease patients. So they had 25% under reporting of cystic fibrosis patients that they now found marked ancestral achondroplasia. It's really quite striking. What's also really interesting is that the exception that proves the rule is phenylketonuria, or PKU. And the reason is that everybody gets their advice from the back of a Coke can for PKU, and we have universal screening from birth very early on for PKU. So even if you have PKU, you don't present like a patient with PKU because we've prevented that disease largely, or in many ways we've done a great job of beginning to prevent the disease because of the way we put people on special diets and screen early on. We've done something very similar at Stanford, and by we I mean Josh Knowles and Nigam Shah. Again, I just want to highlight their brilliant work on this, and in collaboration with the FH Foundation, they've built something called FindFH. And again, it's really their research. I encourage you to take a look at it. But the goal was to take and use a disparate set of clinical notes, conditions, procedures, and build a classifier based on FH patients from Stanford, cross-validate with outside healthcare systems, and demonstrate that, based on the richness of the data, you could clearly separate FH from non-FH patients. And of course that worked. And they then scaled this out, and with the FH Foundation created what I think is the sort of future here, a synthetic map of where the FH patients are and how you might be able to access them. In fact, they made this available through a doctor portal, so that if you are a patient and you have a practice, sorry, if you're a doctor and you have a practice and would like to see who your presumptive FH patients are, you could actually go to the website and dig in and look at that. So I do think this is the future. I think this is exactly what we need to do. I would also argue in some sense that the smartest people at Stanford couldn't take a bunch of data and find presumptive FH patients, would be in a lot of trouble in our country. So I'm really glad that this works. And I would also argue that I think this is ripe for disruptive technology. So I've been saying this for a while. 2 years ago, Color partnered with the FH Foundation. Color is a company out of San Francisco that's doing a lot of population genomic sequencing. They've now actually pivoted or not pivoted, they've added a ton of COVID testing. So these companies that actually got set up to do population sequencing in this context are now pivoting in that same national need. And in fact, I would argue disrupting, our own healthcare delivery as well. In this context, Color, built an FH test that they were able to do for $200. So, here you go, right? Like this is, the smartest folks at Stanford, and a startup with very smart people can, pretty much do something that it used to take, the best in class to do. And I think that's wonderful. This is happening all the time. And Clay Christensen, the late Clay Christensen, wrote an incredible book on this. And of course, this harkens back to Schumpeter and the whole notion that technology is a replenishing cycle, right? And the notion here is that you have a product that has split market. So this is the high end of the market. This is the low end of the market. And the low end of the market in the beginning just looks like a toy. It's just not all that great, but it gets faster, better, cheaper. And it eventually supplants the existing technology. And so the innovator's dilemma is that once you become the established technology, it becomes very hard to stay there. And so, and of course, the classic example now is actually cell phones overtaking landlines, right? You say jump to landline, jump to cell phones. It's actually interesting to see, at least in US, it was not until like 2015 that you actually overtook having, only a cell phone over a landline, right? So you still have a period when you have the old technology, but the new technology begins to overtake quickly. I would argue this is what's going to happen to a lot of testing and healthcare delivery. I think we are ripe for disruption. I want to absolutely disrupt tertiary and quaternary care. I would love nothing more than to have far fewer intensive care needs due to chronic disease. I'd much rather prevent all that stuff in the future based on putting people on the right medication at the right schedule tailored to their biology. And many folks, of course, want to see that world happen. I think the key is that it's not going to happen on its own. It will only happen if we incentivize in the right direction, and that's a joint decision we will make among policymakers, investors, and what you incentivize. This is a cliche at this point. We all know that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. In fact, oil has become toxic waste. And I would argue when I was a child, oil companies were, of course, the most revered and best in the whole wide world. I was born in Venezuela, and we thought of the automotive industry and the fossil fuel industry as just the center of the economy, and they were the biggest companies in the world in the world until they got overtaken by the tech companies that are today the biggest companies in the world. And I would argue the biggest companies in 20 to 30 years are not going to be tech companies. They'll be wet, dry companies. They'll be companies that are doing bio at scale, no doubt in my mind. And I think it begins with marrying the things we're doing now on data into the things that are happening in what Peter Thiel has called atoms, in the world of atoms. We're good in the world of bits. We haven't had a lot of innovation in the world of atoms. And I would say you're just beginning to see innovation in the world of cells. And so bio will take off. And so this becomes, part of where you're really going to transform this from happening at universities into happening in industry at scale. And part of this is just simply economics. Apple has so much cash on hand. Microsoft has so much cash on hand that they have no choice but to go after these industries. And this was several years ago. They've already more than telegraphed their plays. They've become massive entrants into the healthcare, not only the healthcare consumer space, but I would argue beginning hard into the healthcare delivery space soon. And this is beginning with smart devices that then also become research devices. And now you're beginning to see why the hospital systems don't really stand a chance. The data has already left the building. You can get all the data on your phones. It's all protocolized. This was part of the incentive of the Obama and Bush administrations of really pushing forward a digitization of healthcare in the early 2000s and early 2010s. And you're just reaping that, plus the obvious market hotness of the last 4 or 5 years have just extraordinarily exploded, the innovation in this space. I would argue the next that's happening is all digital tracking of biology. There's a company that I followed for a while called Inside Tracker that was doing this kind of following of your bio. I think in the context of COVID, we're going to really reinvent a ton of this again, in particular focused on the immune system and digitizing the immune system and getting all those streams to come in. So expect all of these layered omics to be part of what gets brought in, with what ultimately has to be some way of authenticating all this and living systems for who has access to what kind of data. So this is one example of a kind of health coin that could be produced where there's a plan made between a doctor and an individual, and that includes a shared ledger that accumulates information. And again, this is now in some sense old hat to many of you. Many of you already know far more about fintech and protocolizing exchange of information and smart contracts, that will all come into bio. It will come into bio hard, and it will come to healthcare absolutely hard. It has to. There's no question about it. And the really interesting direction, is to what degree are patients able to control this? And I think the EU's led with a lot on GDPR and putting folks at the center of controlling their data. I think that has been incredibly important. I also think that you're going to have just generational shifts, as more and more of the world's population is far more technology literate than those that are writing policy, then you're just going to reshape this whole world. So it's exciting. I think it's also going to meet just a lot of disruption. And there's just massive amounts of money at stake. I mean, I think that's part of the issue. So here's an example of a therapy. If you thought $12,000 was expensive, here's a just spectacular cure for blindness. Literally magic. It's $850,000. There's a Spark Therapeutics company that's actually already been acquired. How do you, the vast majority of Americans will never make $850,000, like how are they gonna pay for that, right? So the question is one of incentivizing systems. So what have these guys done? They've been extraordinarily smart. The distribution channel is tiny. You can't just go get Luxturna anywhere. It is a surgery, and it's a surgery that's administered with a payment back guarantee. So if there aren't improvements 30 to 90 days or over 30 months, then you can claw back the payment. So, I kind of like that and imagine more of that, being at the heart of this. But it gets even more expensive. So again, this is from a year ago. Zolgensma was an eye-popping $2 million in terms of how much it was going to cost for a therapy. And all of these are, of course, vaccines in many ways, and so as the world is now learning to vaccinate against COVID and learning to create vaccinations at scale, we will of course begin to vaccinate against all kinds of things, including rare diseases and more common diseases. So there are now PCSK9 injectable that are better than the first generation, right? So instead of having to go every week, you go every 6 months, and then there'll also be PCSK9 that you take once, and it transforms your liver. So that's not going to be cheap, but it will be made available, and it becomes this question of who pays and who's got access. And I think again, it's going to be an exciting world. It's one where we're going to have to ask a lot of questions, and the data is going to be key. And maybe I'll leave with this kind of exciting, I thought, kind of forward-looking paper from Andrew Lowe and others on systems for these kind of very expensive therapies, which basically become mortgages on the payments to back to the companies. And I think at that point you begin to see where at some point the system just has to really rethink how this all goes. You can't continue to just ratchet up that price without having not only the obvious outcomes to back it up, but just a realization of the massive need to reduce the cost of all this, which of course will happen. I mean, you saw it in the tech industry, you saw it in the devices industry, you're seeing it now in logistics. This all becomes really a question of time and how these technologies become translated. I do think that Bill made a very important point in his book, which is that it can't go on if you don't continue the three-player game. And I do agree with that. I think that if we try to be radical in one direction or another, right, either, it has to all be, state funding, or it has to be the opposite, right? You got to reduce state funding and let, the private industry pick up the bulk of research. You're going to incentivize, just vastly different outcomes. So getting that balance right, I think, is at the forefront of where much of what we need to do over the coming 2020s lies. I think COVID in particular has one silver lining, which is that it will fortify so much of what we do in healthcare delivery just by the tragic nature of what we're all living through. And it will also just soberingly, I think, make it clear to many of us how important it is to share our data, how to make that available, how just difficult so much of this is. Things that seemed easy are really, really hard, and they're particularly hard to do and do at scale. So bringing it back to the motivating question, particularly of how do you now take this and add a dimension of some of the sickest people aren't even in the databases, right? So this is put aside almost the motivating question of how do we now go and take all of this incredible technology that's been built and make it available to the sickest of the sick. And in my opinion, I think that is going to be the fundamental challenge. I think market solutions will take us so far. I think people will subscribe. People will and have subscribed in the 23andMe setting. But at some point, I think this really does become a question of balancing that three-player game. And it'll swing in I think the direction of just massive needs of institutional investment by all sides. I think pharma will need to invest hard in building new infrastructure. It won't come just from the government, but I think a lot of it will need to be audited and followed in ways that we can all be comfortable about the results. I think that's the real challenge right now. The data that's flowing, not a lot of people have a lot of faith in what they're getting, and that's hard. And that makes it really difficult to make progress. And so the work we are doing as data scientists in pulling infrastructure together, while at times may seem disparate and hard to pull together in the fog of war, I think will be some of the most important work we'll do over the coming years. Because I think this is the basis of creating a new, hopefully fairer, and ideally far more innovative healthcare system that can benefit everybody, right? It has to be able to translate those results far faster and far better and far cheaper so that we can all benefit. So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm honored to be here and happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Carlos, for this thought-provoking talk. Before I start to let people ask you questions, I want to remind everyone that they can post these questions in the chat box. Please do so, and I will try to moderate this and select questions one by one. So first question comes from Andres. So Andres, maybe you want to unmute yourself. Andres is the other co-director of the Cambridge Center for AI Medicine.
Thanks, Mihaela. Hi, Carlos. Great talk, very thought-provoking. My question was around where you thought the low-hanging fruit was in terms of extracting useful, actionable intelligence from genomic data. Do you think it's just a numbers game? We just need more genomes? Do you think the low-hanging fruit is more refined phenotypic characterization? Or do you think there's opportunities for direct AI applications to genomic analysis with the data that we already have?
Yeah, great question.
Or all three.
Yeah, no, I mean, so yes, in that, yeah, absolutely. I think that the challenges are just sort of different in each one of those dimensions. I think there's a challenge in producing genomes at scale that that we have not really dealt with, which is the verifiability of the process. And by that, I mean, when I receive a result of a genetic sequencing, what do I get at the end? A text file. When I go download when I want to go stream the Avengers movie, like, it double, triple checks that I've got permission to do that. How can that be? There's no checksum for genetic data. So you won't get to, production of millions without actually building that system to be automated. Right now, it is semi-automated, right? There are lots and lots of places for human intervention, which are obviously ultimately drags on production. So that we have not gone the last mile in being able to produce millions of genomes at scale. We can just get there because there are lots of people doing it, and that's not, you know, an ideal solution. So I think we got to kind of redo that. I think there's a question of, now let's just imagine, you know, genetic sequencing. What's going to happen in genetic sequencing? I view it a lot like imaging. Well, you're not going to stop imaging. It's going to get better. You're not going to stop producing films in higher resolution. That's just going to get better. So the same way you upgrade your TV, you upgrade your phone, you're obviously going to upgrade your genome. Like, that's an obvious thing to me. So there's I'm going to keep going back and back and back to do better, and do better on things like HLA and regions of genomes that we know are important that we don't really know how to interpret yet, non-coding regions, all that stuff. Like, we'll layer. And that will require knowledge bases that are then used to, you know, automate and improve the automation. So yes, there's a ton of like real biology that needs to get done to produce the kind of interpretation things we need. And again, that's a different, I would say, issue than how do I go and produce genomes at scale. And then I think that in terms of what may be general problems that genomics motivates, I do think there are a ton. I think there's some really fascinating search problems that are kind of unique to biology, and like, you know, like topologically unique to biology, right? Like you know, the genome folding up in itself to create interactions, and, you know, what we almost metaphysically called epiphenomena. I mean, we did metaphysically call it epiphenomena because we couldn't explain it. That's why it's called an epiphenomena. Like, that doesn't work, right? Like, you got to break that down. Let's break it down into like what's actually happening in biology. And that means really new models that, like, maybe even coming from, like, I don't know, physics of multi-dimensions, because what is happening in a genome unfolding itself and interacting in a cell? I would say, you know, the physics of multiple dimensions. So I do think all of those are going to be interesting. I would place bets on all. As an investor, I would have a portfolio, and being a dumb investor, I'd put a third, and then update.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So I'm going to read a few of the other questions such that we go at speed, and you got many questions. So a question from Jorge Aponte, who says that he loved the talk and he will watch it again, and it's very timely. And he asks how to make cheaper or more viable solutions such that incredible drugs are available for more people, especially the people that cannot afford them.
Yeah. No, I think that 100%. And I would say it's absolutely happening. So when I gave this, or part of this lecture, about a year or two ago in Tennessee at Vanderbilt, I had a guy in the audience who was the head of the Medicaid programs in Tennessee. And he said to me, I'll have you know that Medicaid covers PCSK9 and Luxturna. Thank you very much. We have very strict policies and we have to go through and create the systems, but, you know, the payers are there, and ultimately the state is a phenomenal payer, right? It's not that the state is a good payer, it's a phenomenal payer. It's got great purchasing power. So if you can really make the economic arguments, then absolutely you can translate it. I mean, the same way we're buying COVID vaccines, right? The state's paying. So you can get there. I think it really becomes a question of making the value proposition. And that's happening with COVID, because your money's no good with COVID. It's what happens after COVID. So, like, will the same things we're doing for COVID work for other infectious diseases? Will it work for other rheumatological things like MS? We don't know yet. So I think that's how you do it.
Thank you, Carlos. So we got another question from Alex Gimson, who is one of the core faculty in CCAIM. So is how in your model do you account for the social determinants of health, which are outside of consumer control, and on which it's difficult or impossible for them to lead the way?
Yeah, so great question. I don't have an easy answer, except to say that it's all about incentivizing behavior. And how do you herd cats? You move the milk. Like, so you can definitely move behavior, you know, using what you learn about social determinants of health doesn't mean you can't impact them. So classic example, like in FH, the last mile problem is actually getting the patient to take their medication. Even if I've gone through all getting it reimbursed, like half of them may not take their medication. Okay. So solving that is like an almost smart city problem, especially for parts of the population that like are just what used to be called non-compliant, right? Okay. Non-compliant, I think, is like, why aren't you serving the customer? Right? Like, why does the customer not want your product? What are you doing wrong around that? And if you can solve that problem, I think you can actually get to this. So, and you guys do a much better job of this than we do in this country in terms of prevention. So I don't think these have to be expensive solutions. And I don't think these have to be solutions that only meet the needs. In fact, they can't be solutions that meet the needs of the top 20%. It's the opposite. They need to be, we learn from the top 20%, they subsidize the same way they subsidize cell phone development, and then you use production to move it on down. And so I think if we can do that, but it only honestly works depending on what we want to incentivize. Like the same phone can be used to incentivize health as it can be to incentivize, just like terrible addictive behavior. And that's not a question of technology. It's not a question of social determinants of health. It's literally a question of how did you write the code and what bounds did you put on it and why did you do it that way?
Thank you, Carlos. Another question from Faride Jalali: how the healthcare utilization can be managed better for the patients with multimorbidity? And can machine learning and AI help in this regard?
Yeah, so that's one where I think there's a lot of wonderful progress being made. I'll take a quick example out of diabetes. And I'm going to sort of paraphrase, but what basically happens, as I understand it, is that when a patient first goes into diabetes treatment, you tend to try metformin. Most of the time, that's a good thing. Not everyone responds to metformin. And so at least in the United States, you switch them to one of 3 other medications. And we tend to do that randomly. So we're on protocol. We literally kind of randomly switch them to one of those 3 medications. However, there are elements in that patient's journey that predict which one of those 3 paths they would do much better on, okay? And so I am optimistic that taking a patient journey view, right? So saying, this is the protocol. If that patient isn't doing well on protocol, how do we branch? And really learning through that in the same way we've learned in lots of other areas of behavior will help. Because if not, this explodes. So, and in diabetes treatment, once you go down to 3 or 4 rounds of drug switching, you're on like 1,200 different medications. So like nobody's on protocol then. So the only things that work are things on protocol, ideally randomized into protocols like you guys have done brilliantly in the recovery trial. I'd love to figure out how I do the recovery trial in this country. I can't, right? So we need to build infrastructure to do that. And part of that then is, how do I work with the natural experiments in the system and then retool code? So I can learn from those natural experiments, see what things are clearly not working, and then sort of prevent those by sort of almost deleting them as possible paths in the system and incentivizing doctors to say, okay, here are the care pathways that we want. That's very broadly how the United States is trying to move in that direction in lots of ways, different payment models, different risk models, and we're trying lots of experiments. And ultimately, all of healthcare is local. And so the other piece of this is that what's going to work in some parts isn't going to work in other localities. And so I'm excited to see how those experiments shake out.
Thank you. So Sam Lambert is saying, thanks for an interesting talk, Carlos. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how these types of market forces are going to lead to the commodification of minority people data. Won't this be of exploitative and increase a lack of trust in healthcare providers? And just that this is related to the New England Journal of Medicine paper, The Illusion of Inclusion.
Look, I think you have to follow the data. Okay, my current view is that there's so much opportunity to do better, right? Like the current system is so tilted. And I'll give you one example. There was a big multi-ethnic study on prostate cancer. And the paper's like, we're the first big multi-ethnic study on prostate cancer. And here you go. Here's the risk profile that's now multi-ethnic for prostate cancer. It's like 100,000 people. 80,000 were Caucasian. 10,000 were African-American. 3,000 were Asians. The rest were a smattering of people. In the United States, African-Americans are more than 10% of the population, and they have like a 3-fold higher risk of prostate cancer. So you actually, like, if you were just sampling at random prostate cancer patients, it would be really hard to underrepresent African-Americans. And they were underrepresented in what was heralded to be the largest multi-transethnic study that they put a press release out of them. So it's like, there is so much opportunity that anybody who said, you know what, I'm going to focus on African-American genetics, go, awesome. People would love that. I'm going to go focus on Hispanics. Go, all power to you, because there's like literally massive unmet need. So now, why would you want to go do the project, right? And where are you going to get the resources to do it is a separate question. And so in some sense, I think part of this will be the fairest thing we could do in this country is sequence everybody who got hit with COVID, especially if you got severe COVID, especially if you ended up in the hospital. So if we like just had that as a policy, did you like go spend days? You're at the top of the list for people we're going to genome sequence in this country. Like you'd massively go in the right direction. You'd oversample comorbidity. You'd oversample the sickest of the sick. You'd oversample minorities, right? Like just COVID has done an amazing job of finding out for you all those social determinants of health, exactly where you should be operating. So like just treating COVID and over treating COVID will move you in the right direction. And I think you build trust that way, and then you expand from there. I also think that like young people are extraordinarily much smarter than any of us, but just by technology. Like technology makes humans smarter and smarter and smarter every generation. You do not need to explain this to people. Like I assure you that a 15-year-old Maasai kid absolutely understands why they would need to participate. They're global. They're on TikTok. They're like, are you kidding me? They understand more about this than any of us in this room. Seriously. So if you think about the future, you think about millennial, Gen Zs, and the kids that come after Gen Zs, you do not need to explain it to them. You're going to say, why wasn't I in the room in the beginning? You're going to need to apologize for not having started to include them right away. Seriously. That's literally my view. I think the kids will be at the door clamoring to get in and say, how did you not include me? What were you thinking?
Thank you, Carlos. A final question. So from Avinash. So, hi, Carlos, thanks for a great talk. 23andMe has so much genetic data, probably the most in the world. And how do you see this data playing out in the future, perhaps outside the area of therapeutics?
Yeah, so I think 23andMe has a very nice database. They've taken time to build it. I think if you tried to turn around and build something similar, you could do it faster, better, cheaper, right? Just by the very nature of technology. Like, I don't think it would be hard to get to another 5 million people if you were to start today. Now, by the time you get to 5 million, they'll be at 50 million, right? So it's not like you're going to necessarily outrun them. But my point is that what they learned to do is far more valuable in some sense than the data asset that they currently have, right? Otherwise, you just did one thing once. Like, you literally have to have had process and build a serious moat to give you a kind of competitive advantage. And a huge open question is, what would be the competitive advantage of having a giant map of genotype to phenotype? Because so much of that is kind of shared human biology. So it's not like you're going to prevent anybody else from eventually finding that out. Like, we will learn all of that stuff. It's science. It'll get found out. It'll be part of the public domain and so on. So the ultimate value is going to come down to actual biology and samples and reagents. So like, when all is said and done, what's valuable? Chatix is valuable. The rest is infrastructure. It's getting to the actual object that you then need to mass produce to get into everybody else. Okay, so in that sense, I really do think the limit will be reagents. It will be searching in the tails for people who have superhuman mutations. There are X-Men people out there, and God bless them, thank God. I mean, that's wonderful. We want to study human biology. It's fascinating. We're like phenotypically just a spectacularly interesting species. And then there are like what happens in the majority of cases, which is the opposite of what happens in the tails. Like when you want to treat in medicine, you want to treat what happens in the majority of cases. And that means actually looking at combinations. And that's part of the other thing that's going to happen in genetics, because we're beginning to look at much more admixed people. So it's not just, let me go play the 19th century Victorian anthropologist from the Pitt Rivers Museum and make a list of the 283 different types of humans out there, you know, and like put them in their little boxes like that we know that world wasn't right. Of course we know that world wasn't right. And so what do we actually want to do? We want to study human biology and then take advantage of the fact that we are creating just an incredible human population as we're mixing and mixing and mixing. And all those combinations actually will tell us far more about genetics. Because, and again, not just to put a caricature on it, the UK Biobank is one, you know, pasty genome on a rock in the North Atlantic. You guys have done a nice job of studying that in one environment. It's, you know, like, it's one environment though. Now, if you look at all the combinations that have happened, you're going to have a lot more information just from a genetic point of view of what has happened in the rest of the planet, right? Because you have recombined into lots of backgrounds. And we have a common humanity, right? At any point in our genome, we are actually more closely related 80% of the time to a random person on the planet than anybody we would choose in our population and anybody we would choose in our town, right? So that sort of shared biology means we can leverage a lot by reanalyzing our data and then bringing in the places where we haven't studying, leaving space for that, and then getting at the actual things we're interested in, which is the genome to phenotype to these much more complicated maps. It's not just about like getting the anthropological genetics right. That's awesome, and we got to do that. That's the beginning. That's a scaffolding on which we build the rest of the knowledge base.
Thank you, Carlos, so much for all the insights and the enthusiasm. And also how wonderful your talk has spanned so many areas that we hope in this center to touch upon. So thank you so much for this inspirational talk. We are going to post this talk online such that some of you have said that you want to watch it and rewatch it. It will be on our center's YouTube channel. So please watch it and rewatch it and send it to your friends to take a look. Thank you, Carlos, very much.
Thank you.